something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate towards the inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright, if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the Numina that cross our path. The only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. But he can make no progress with himself unless he becomes very much acquainted with his own nature. Unfortunately, a terrifying ignorance prevails in this respect, and an equally great aversion in increasing the knowledge of his intrinsic character. However, in the most unexpected quarters nowadays, we find people who can no longer blink the fact that something ought to be done with man in regard to his psychology. Unfortunately, the little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. We can, of course, hope for the undeserved grace of God, who hears our prayers, but God, who also does not hear our prayers, wants to become man, and for that purpose he has chosen, through the Holy Ghost, the creaturely man filled with darkness, the natural man, who is tainted with original sin, and who learnt the divine arts and sciences from the fallen angels. The guilty man is eminently suitable, and is therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation, not the guiltless one who holds aloof from the world and refuses to pay his tribute to life, for in him the dark God would find no room. Go Navy! That's Navy F-18s flying over the Naval Academy football game in Annapolis, Maryland. Paragraph 647. Since the apocalypse, we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as with good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy must take place in man. This involves man in a new responsibility. He can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of his littleness and nothingness. For the dark God has slipped the atom bomb and chemical weapons into his hand and given him the power to empty out the apocalyptic vials of wrath on his fellow creatures. Since he has been granted an almost godlike power, he can no longer remain blind and unconscious. He must know something of God's nature and of metaphysical processes if he is to understand himself and thereby achieve gnosis of the divine. As we've just had the Navy F-18s flying over the house, we hear the very power that Dr. Jung was concerned about. In paragraph 747, when Dr. Jung refers to the apocalypse, he's referring to World War II. This book was written 11 years after the end of World War II. Let me read the first sentence of paragraph 747 once again. Since the apocalypse, we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as with good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy must take place in man. This involves man in a new responsibility. Now I become emotional about that, because all my life, now I become emotional about that because I was raised in the Navy, and I was taught by my father to say, "Go Navy," around Naval Academy football games. What could be wrong with that? But now I do realize that those same F-18s deliver evil as well as good. I recall in the movie Witness, where the little boy, Samuel, finds Harrison Ford's pistol and begins to play with it. His grandfather takes the gun away from him, and the boy Samuel says, "Well, we'll only shoot the bad men." And his grandfather says, "And how will you know the bad men?" Certainly when you're in an F-18 dropping a bomb, it is very difficult to decide whether it's going to land on a good person or a bad person.